Today we're diving into a story that isn't just timely, it's urgent. It's about power, pressure, and what happens when the voices we trust the most go to war with the institutions meant to protect us. From billionaires to judges, students to protesters, this story doesn't just ask what happened, it asks what's at stake. It was just after sunrise in Silver Ridge, Colorado, a quiet tech town nestled against the foothills, when the message that would rattle the country appeared on X. Elon Musk was in town visiting a new energy storage facility his team had been quietly developing, tucked between the red rock cliffs and dry pine forests. He had flown in the night before, accompanied by his strategist Marcus Vell and a few security staff, expecting a routine inspection and perhaps a quiet evening at the remote compound. But when Marcus handed him a slim tablet over breakfast, everything shifted. The headline glared back at him in bold. Federal judge blocks deportation of tech smuggling rings members, cites 18th century law. Musk blinked. Beneath the headline was a name he knew all too well, Judge James Boasberg. For most Americans, Boasberg was anonymous, a procedural name buried in footnotes. But to Musk, he represented something much bigger, a judiciary growing increasingly detached from reality and, in his view, dangerously unaccountable. The ruling invoked the Alien Enemies Act, an archaic statute from 1798 rarely touched even in wartime, but Boasberg had used it to temporarily shield a group of Venezuelan nationals accused of funneling stolen tech through third-party fronts, citing potential violations of international asylum treaties. Musk didn't care about the legal rationale. He saw obstruction, not nuance. He stared at the article, silent, then set down his coffee. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Want me to prep a statement?" Musk didn't respond immediately. Then, with a flat voice and cold determination, he said, "No prep, no filter, not this time." He opened X, typed 12 words and hit post. "You're watching democracy die one ruling at a time. No fluff, no hashtags, no context." Within 10 minutes it had been shared over 50,000 times. Within an hour it passed 200,000. The internet caught fire, right-leaning commentators praised his courage, legal experts debated his recklessness, news anchors scrambled to confirm the details of the court case, some calling it a misguided overreach, others calling it Musk's most dangerous moment yet. But Elon wasn't watching the reactions. He was already writing the next post. "This isn't about law," he wrote. "It's about judges rewriting the rules to fit their ideology. Enough." For a man known for provocative statements, something about this one was different. It wasn't meant to stir conversation. It was a declaration of war. By mid-morning, Boasberg's name was trending for the first time in his career. In courtrooms, law offices, and classrooms across the country, people were beginning to ask the same question. Can a billionaire bring the courts to heel with just his voice? In Washington, D.C., where Judge Boasberg presided, security staff had already noticed a spike in anonymous phone calls. The chief clerk flagged multiple threatening emails. None of it was officially confirmed, but the tension was rising. But Boasberg himself said nothing. He carried on, head down, working on the next case. But for Musk, this was just the beginning. The ruling wasn't a legal setback, it was a symbol, a flashpoint, and he had just turned it into a national fire. By mid-morning, Elon Musk's post had become more than a trending topic. It was a cultural rupture. Newsrooms across the country scrambled to interpret his words, while cable networks looped his quote beneath blazing banners. Democracy dying in real time? On social media, the divide grew sharper by the hour. Influencers reposted the message with rallying cries. Talk show hosts dissected it live on air, some hailing Musk as a truth-teller, others warning of demagoguery. In a soundproof room on the upper floor of Neural Grid's Silver Ridge campus, strategist Marcus Vell monitored the firestorm on a wall of screens. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered to himself. The hashtag judicial revolt had begun trending globally, joined quickly by Boasberg and Muskvez, the bench. Within 12 hours, the narrative was no longer about immigration policy or the Alien Enemies Act. It had become a referendum on the legitimacy of the judiciary itself. In Washington, D.C., Judge James Boasberg sat at his desk in the federal courthouse, eyes fixed on a memo from the clerk's office detailing the surge in threats and unusual activity. He didn't flinch. He'd presided over terrorism trials, political protests, even high-profile whistleblower cases. But this felt different. Not louder. Deeper. As though the very ground beneath the judicial branch was starting to shift. Still, he made no statement. Silence, he believed, was the robe's shield. But silence doesn't hold long in a world echoing with digital outrage. Back in Colorado, Musk sat on a leather armchair near a conference table, watching news clips play on silent loop across multiple screens. He was calm, almost detached. "This isn't noise," he said to Marcus. "This is pressure. Systems don't crack from outside, they rot from within, and this one's already hollow." Marcus hesitated. "You realize what you've started?" Musk nodded. "Good." Meanwhile, in diners, classrooms, and living rooms, ordinary Americans began picking sides, often without fully understanding what the ruling had even been about. But they didn't need case law to feel the tremors. Musk had reframed the issue. This wasn't about law, it was about power. Who had it, who abused it, and who had the guts to say it out loud. From Portland to Pensacola, debates ignited. Was Musk right to call out judges? Were unelected officials hiding behind immunity? Or was this just a dangerous step toward mob pressure and institutional collapse? As one commentator on national television put it, when a billionaire can point at a judge and make half the country question the court's integrity, that's not discourse, that's destabilization. And yet, to millions, it didn't feel like destabilization, it felt like truth. But truth was fragmenting, rapidly. Lines were forming not around legal arguments but around loyalties. The air was thick with tension, and for those within the judiciary, one terrifying realization began to surface. This wasn't just backlash, it was a movement. And it wasn't slowing down. In the heart of Washington, D.C., inside the marble-walled chambers of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Alton Reese stood at a quiet crossroads. A man of principle and control, Reese had built his career on judicial restraint and the belief that the law must remain unswayed by tides of public emotion. But Elon Musk's digital barrage had pierced through the court's historical insulation like nothing before. Reese had read the initial tweet in silence, then read it again. It wasn't just a critique. It was a challenge to the authority of the entire judicial branch, laced with public fury and technological reach. Behind closed doors, he met with his two trusted advisors, Judge Talia Serrano, a retired appellate judge known for her sharp clarity, and Charles Redd, a constitutional historian who once clerked under Reese himself. "If I say nothing," Reese began, pacing slowly beneath the high-arched windows, "I look weak. If I say too much, I drag the court into the mud." Charles leaned forward, his voice steady. "You've spent decades defending neutrality. Don't stop now. Say what must be said, but don't let him bait you into the arena." Meanwhile, across the country, Musk had already escalated. His next post was not a subtweet, it was a direct strike. "When you let judges like Boasberg run wild and you say nothing, you're complicit." The tag, @ChiefJusticeReese. The platform shook. The words complicit and silent were soon echoing through podcasts, primetime TV panels, and protest signs. Reese felt the wall closing in. Not from the law, but from the public square. He wasn't used to the rules of this battlefield. Musk, however, thrived in it. In his world, perception moved faster than principle, and silence equaled surrender. But Reese wasn't just a man, he was the guardian of an institution. His decision couldn't be impulsive. After long deliberation, he instructed his team to prepare a short but firm statement. The message would walk the finest of lines, acknowledging public concern without validating Musk's assault. It would remind the nation that courts answered to law, not likes. Across digital screens and Sunday op-eds, the next move was awaited like a verdict. And with the battle lines drawn between the court and the court of opinion, both men stood on opposite sides of the same question. What happens when justice meets influence? And who speaks louder? The ripple effect of Elon Musk's posts was no longer confined to screens. Across the country, In courthouses once considered the quiet backbone of American governance, a new reality was setting in. Judges were under siege. In Caldera Falls, California, court liaison Rhea Kessler arrived early to her office in the sandstone-faced federal building downtown, only to find a note from security on her desk. Possible disruption alert. Increased patrols recommended. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Overnight, anonymous voicemails had flooded the courthouse's inbox. Some were vague, angry rants. Others were far more specific. One email listed Judge Boasberg's children by name and school schedule. The local marshal office quietly doubled security at entrances. There was no public announcement. There didn't need to be. Inside the building, everyone felt the shift. This wasn't procedural backlash. This was personal. In Red Rock, Arizona, retired civil rights attorney Colton Rain sat in his modest home, sipping black coffee while the news played in the background. He watched footage of protesters waving signs that read "Black robes, dirty hands," and "Unelected and untouchable," a phrase scrolled across the ticker. "Boasberg out hits 3M tweets." Colton turned to his wife, Marcia, and muttered, "I've never seen anything like this, not even during the immigration battles in E6. She handed him the paper and sat beside him, her brow furrowed. "They're not angry at a ruling," she said softly. "They're angry at the whole idea of judges existing outside their reach." Colton nodded slowly, the weight of decades spent defending that very reach pressing hard on his chest. Meanwhile, inside the Evershaw Courthouse in Washington, D.C., Boasberg continued working silently, refusing interviews, press statements, or public retorts. His clerks, however, could feel the walls tightening. Reporters loitered outside. Protesters had appeared that morning, only 6 of them. But they held signs and stared through the glass like waiting vultures. One clerk confided to another, "It's like we're not a court anymore. We're a target." From coast to coast, federal judges began holding private calls. Emails circulated. There was no plan, no central directive, just a shared sense that the robe no longer shielded them. In chambers and law offices, the once unthinkable question was whispered aloud. Was it still worth it? The job, the wait, the scrutiny, when every decision could become a headline, a hashtag, a threat to one's family? At night, in a group message thread of judicial staffers, someone posted a simple question: what happens when we're afraid to rule? The responses trickled in slowly. One judge replied, "We stop ruling." Another, more ominously, "Or someone else starts." And as fear settled into routine, a truth emerged that no one wanted to admit. Elon Musk hadn't just criticized the courts, he had made them vulnerable, not by law, but by voice. And in a democracy built on quiet decisions, that was the loudest threat of all. In the small, sunlit town of Bay Hollow, Mississippi, the tension echoing through courtrooms and Senate chambers landed somewhere unexpected: a high school civics classroom. Leona Marsh, a veteran teacher with a gentle drawl and a sharp mind, stood before her 11th grade students trying to explain the fundamentals of checks and balances. But today the lesson had taken on a strange urgency. The projector behind her displayed screenshots of Elon Musk's viral posts, including the now infamous line, "Judges rewriting the law to fit their ideology must be held accountable." Leona paused mid-sentence as a hand shot up from the second row. It was Imani Thorne, always quiet, always observant. "Ms. Marsh," she asked, voice low but clear, "can billionaires fire judges now?" The class fell silent. Leona looked at her student, caught between instinct and reality. "No," she began, choosing her words carefully. "That's not how the system works. Judges are appointed for life, especially at the federal level, to stay independent from pressure, from voters or billionaires." Another student snorted quietly. "Tell that to the guy with 200 million followers." A third chimed in. "If you can't fire a judge but you can make the whole country hate them, isn't that kind of the same thing?" Leona felt her heart sink. Not because the question was naive, but because it wasn't. It was disturbingly perceptive. Her mind flashed back to the protest footage, the courthouse lockdowns, the interviews with legal analysts who spoke in carefully neutral tones while their eyes betrayed real fear. She turned back to the class. "Our system isn't perfect," she said slowly, "but it's built on the idea that some people, judges, have to make decisions even when they're unpopular. That's part of the job." Amani raised her hand again. "But what happens when they're too scared to do it?" The question hung in the room like smoke, and for the first time in her teaching career, Leona didn't have a ready answer. Instead, she simply nodded, walked to the board, and wrote it down in big letters. What happens when judges get scared? The bell rang moments later, but no one moved right away. Outside, the world kept spinning, but inside that classroom a truth had taken root. The guardrails of democracy don't just exist in courtrooms. They live in questions like that. Inside a sleek, glass-walled conference room at Neuralgrid's private compound in Silver Ridge, Elon Musk sat at the head of a long table, dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans, a tablet glowing softly in his hands. Across from him were Joy Cranford, a former congressional counsel turned legal consultant, and Theo Arledge, a sharp-tongued tech lobbyist who had helped shape online speech legislation in 3 states. On the table in front of them were folders marked with case titles, timelines, and judicial rulings, all cross-referenced to reform-blocking decisions from the past 5 years. "Look at the pattern," Musk said, not looking up. "Same names, same outcomes, same system protecting itself." Joy leaned forward, her tone measured. "If you push for impeachment, it becomes the only story. Again." Elon didn't flinch. "Good. Let them see how broken it is." He tapped the screen and pulled up Judge Boasberg's profile again. "The courts aren't just wrong," he said. "They're insulated. They fail upward. They answer to no one. And worst of all, they know it." Theo chuckled nervously. "Well, technically they answer to Congress." Musk cut him off with a glance. "Technically, gravity doesn't care about power lines. That doesn't mean we ignore the fire when it hits." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was focused, purposeful. Musk wasn't ranting. He was planning. Joy glanced out the window at the distant mountains, then back at him. "What if the courts are the last machine keeping the chaos out?" she asked. "What if, despite everything, they're still the one thing between this country and something worse?" Elon finally looked up. "Then maybe chaos is overdue." The room stayed still for a beat too long. Joy looked over at Theo, who scribbled something in his notebook. That last line, it was going to leak. They all knew it, and when it did, it wouldn't sound like a policy position. It would sound like a battle cry, a billionaire declaring war on the foundation of civil society. But Elon Musk didn't care. In fact, he counted on it. That night, just as predicted, the quote surfaced anonymously on several political blogs. Within hours it was trending. Chaos is overdue. To some, it was terrifying. To others, it was clarifying. Either way, it was fuel. And somewhere deep inside the federal judiciary, judges who had spent their careers shrouded in quiet dignity now began to ask themselves, how long until the gavel isn't enough to hold the line? The morning air in Caldera Falls, California was cool and brittle when Cale Brimley, a 42-year-old former Navy engineer from nearby Modesto, walked up the steps of the Stanton Federal Courthouse with a folded American flag under one arm and a battered bullhorn in the other. Security cameras caught him arriving just after 7:45 a.m., alone, determined, and unarmed. By 8 a.m. his voice was echoing through the courthouse lobby, each word landing like a crack in the marble. "They've hijacked our country, our laws, our voices. I'm not leaving until someone explains why judges are protecting criminals." The phrase was pulled directly from one of Elon Musk's earlier posts, but Cale wasn't just quoting, he believed it. Inside the courthouse, panic spread quickly. Court liaison Raya Kessler was preparing for a docket of immigration hearings when she heard the shouting. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Emergency protocols, initiated, marshal, response, and route. When she peeked through the blinds of her office, she saw Cale sitting cross-legged in the center of the lobby floor, the flag draped across his knees like armor. He wasn't yelling now, just waiting, calm, angry, unmoving. By 9 a.m., the footage had gone viral. Dozens of people stood outside the courthouse, some holding signs, others live streaming. A few cheered Cale on, others came just to watch. By 10 a.m., the U.S. Marshals had set up a perimeter, carefully avoiding escalation. Cale's bullhorn sat beside him now, battery drained. He still hadn't left. Inside, court staff had been evacuated. Judge Boasberg, who happened to be in the building for a regional judiciary coordination meeting, was escorted to a secure office. He asked a single question: "Is he armed?" The answer: no, just angry. But anger, like electricity, doesn't need a weapon to spark disaster. By early afternoon, a second group of protesters arrived, this time organized. Some wore face coverings, some carried flags. One brought a metal baton, another threw a brick at the courthouse doors. It missed, shattering harmlessly against the reinforced glass, but the message was unmistakable. That was the moment the courthouse officially shut down. The lockdown order was issued just before 3 p.m. News helicopters circled. Cable news anchors cut away from their usual programming. Breaking: armed protesters surround federal courthouse. Musk connection questioned. But Elon Musk hadn't said a word all day. He didn't need to. The footage of Cale Brimley had already been stitched into montages online, overlaid with patriotic music, clips of Musk's quotes, and flashes of courtroom rulings deemed controversial. The story had become legend in real time. At 6:15 p.m., Cale was finally escorted out peacefully. No weapons, no resistance. He was arrested but refused to answer questions. His only statement: "I just wanted them to listen." By that night, dozens of smaller protests had erupted outside other courthouses in cities like Omaha, Tampa, and Boise. Some were peaceful, some weren't. But the pattern was clear. The judiciary was no longer sacred ground. In a rare move, Judge McKay O'Sheridan, a veteran federal judge stationed in Sacramento, appeared in a live stream from his home that night. With dark circles under his eyes and a tie slightly askew, he looked into the camera and said, "I will not resign. I will not stay silent, and I will not be intimidated. This court belongs to the people, but it does not answer to threats." His voice trembled slightly, but his words landed like thunder. It was the first public stand from the bench, and it wouldn't be the last. But even then it was clear the courthouse wasn't just a building anymore, it was the battlefield. Far from the chaos of courthouses and viral clips, in a modest brick home in Fort Jasper, Indiana, 62-year-old Rowena Drake sat at her kitchen table, the flickering light of her old laptop casting a glow on her face. A retired public defender who had spent her career defending clients no one else wanted: addicts, undocumented families, domestic abuse victims. Rowena had watched the headlines with a growing ache in her chest: the protests, the bomb threats, the man with the bullhorn. And through it all, the silence of those who used to believe in the system. She hadn't practiced law in over 5 years, and she'd never sought attention. But as the country spun faster into outrage, something inside her refused to stay quiet. She set up her phone, balanced it against a stack of worn legal texts, and hit record. No script, no polish, just her voice, steady, tired, and honest. "I've stood in front of a lot of judges," she began. "Some were fair, some were cold, a few were just plain wrong. But they all showed up, day after day, knowing someone would always be angry with them." She looked into the lens, the weight of decades behind her eyes. Now we're calling them traitors? For doing their jobs? Threatening their kids? That's not accountability. That's a mob. She paused. You don't fix a system by burning it down. You fix it by remembering why it was built, and who it's supposed to protect. The video wasn't meant to go viral, but it did. First shared among legal circles, then picked up by educators, and finally reposted by national news anchors across the spectrum. Its simplicity cut through the noise, and what no one expected was who would share it next. Elon Musk himself. His caption was brief: "I disagree with her, but I respect her." That acknowledgement changed the temperature of the conversation. Not overnight, not entirely, but enough. The next morning, talk show panels opened with Rowena's voice. Editorials quoted her word for word, and in federal courthouses across the country, judges who had considered early retirement quietly closed their resignation letters, and returned to work. Not because the threat was gone, but because someone had reminded them that courage didn't need to shout to be heard. In a quiet office on the 6th floor of the Albuquerque Federal Courthouse, Judge Everett Quaid sat in front of his laptop, watching Rowena Drake's video for the 3rd time. He didn't blink. For weeks he'd been carrying a resignation letter in his briefcase, signed, dated, ready. The pressure had become unbearable. Anonymous threats, vitriol in the media, and the growing sense that each ruling he made was no longer about law, but survival. But something in Rowena's voice, a quiet defiance shaped by decades in courtrooms much harsher than his own, pulled him back from the edge. When the video ended, Quaid reached into his drawer, pulled out the resignation letter, and folded it neatly in half before placing it in the bottom of his file cabinet. Then, he locked it. Later that day, he summoned his clerks into chambers. No preamble, no formality, just a sentence that cut through the tension like a blade. "We're not going anywhere, not while it still matters." Across the country, similar moments played out in quiet corners of the judiciary. Judges who had felt isolated, under attack, now realized they weren't standing alone. Rowena hadn't offered them comfort, she had offered them clarity. Meanwhile, Elon Musk, who had dominated headlines for weeks, went uncharacteristically silent. No tweets, no interviews, no panels. His repost of Rowena's video with the caption, "I disagree with her, but I respect her," had landed like a shift in weather. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't surrender, but it was a rare acknowledgement that even in a war of ideologies, there was room for decency. The volume didn't vanish, but it softened. The protests didn't stop, but they scattered, and in that brief lull, the country found itself staring at a moment of rare reflection. Not agreement, but respect. The kind that doesn't erase conflict but makes it survivable. And for the first time in weeks, the institutions under fire weren't just enduring, they were breathing. In the quiet town of Larkhaven, Colorado, the storm felt far away, at least on the surface. Inside a downtown diner, Janelle Hart, a waitress who'd been working the morning shift for 12 years, poured coffee for 2 regulars seated by the window. They were mid-argument, again. One slammed his mug down and said, "At least Musk has the guts to say what we're all thinking." The other shook his head, replying, "Judges aren't supposed to answer to us, they're supposed to answer to the law." Janelle didn't interrupt. She simply cleared their plates and carried them back to the kitchen, the conversation lingering in her mind. Later that night, while wiping down the counter, she replayed Rowena Drake's video on her phone. Something about it stuck with her. Not the politics, not the law, but the tone, the calm, the conviction, the refusal to yell. It reminded her of her grandmother, a former court clerk who used to say, "Truth doesn't need to shout to be true." And slowly, across communities like hers, trust didn't come roaring back, but it began to flicker, not because of a ruling, not because of a billionaire's silence, but because of one voice, plain-spoken, thoughtful, and rooted in something deeper than outrage. A voice that didn't demand agreement, only attention, and in that flicker, something fragile but vital returned. The idea that we could still listen to each other, even if we didn't see the world the same way. In a quiet bedroom above a hardware store in Bay Hollow, 17-year-old Imani Thorne sat cross-legged on her bed, laptop perched on a pillow, eyes fixed on the blinking cursor. The National Scholarship essay prompt was simple: what role should justice play in democracy? At first, she wasn't sure what to write. The past few weeks had been a blur of headlines, walkouts, and arguments, even in her own home. Her older brother had raged about corrupt judges. Her aunt reposted Musk's quotes daily, but her teacher, Ms. Marsh, had told her something that wouldn't leave her alone. The most dangerous thing isn't when people are wrong, it's when they stop asking why. So she wrote. Not about Musk, not about protests, but about Rowena Drake, about Judge Quaid, about a system no one thinks about until it breaks. Judges, she typed, don't campaign. They don't promise things. They don't try to be liked. And maybe that's the point. She poured her frustration, her confusion, and her hope into 1,500 words. Her final line read, "Judges don't always get it right, but we need them to be brave enough to try, even when it makes us angry, especially then." Her teacher submitted it to the committee, but someone else found it too, a classmate, then a local journalist, then a national podcast. Before long, Imani's essay was everywhere, not because it shouted, but because it reminded people of something they'd forgotten. The strength of democracy isn't in popularity, it's in quiet courage. And sometimes it takes a young voice to echo what adults have stopped saying out loud. The story that unfolded wasn't just about Elon Musk or Judge Boasberg. It wasn't about a tweet or a protest or even a court ruling. It was about something deeper. How fragile trust can be when voices grow louder than principles, and how easily institutions built on quiet judgment can be shaken by unchecked influence. The lesson wasn't that courts are perfect, it's that they must be allowed to make unpopular decisions without fear, because justice isn't about applause, it's about restraint. And when we demand that judges become celebrities or scapegoats, we erode the very balance we rely on to stay free. But amid the noise, a retired defender, a hesitant judge, a curious student, each reminded the nation that clarity doesn't require volume, just conviction. We learned that democracy doesn't break in a moment of anger. It breaks when we stop believing in the slow, deliberate process that protects us from that anger. In the end, the story left us with a quiet warning. When power speaks too loudly, we must listen even more carefully to those who whisper with wisdom. Because once trust in judgment is gone, what remains is not justice, but spectacle.